Thank you all for giving me your time and listening to me, because I'm a little bit intimidated to talk to other people who've all managed danger in their own field work and probably know more about it than I do. And I'm kind of have a reputation for being an expert on this thing, which I'm not sure if I am or not. You know as much about it as I do, but because of my own particular history, I did field work in Northern Ireland, and when I immediately got back, the first thing people would ask me is, how did you do that, and how did you survive, and how did you manage the danger? And so I went to, Carolyn Nordstrom invited me to give a paper at the Kroeber Anthropological Society at Berkeley just when I came back, and so I wrote up this little paper, and then someone said, well, you should publish that, and I sent it off to a journal, and it was published, and no one had written about, surprisingly, or published anything on specifically and formally on managing danger in fieldwork. And by being literally the first person to publish in that area, then everyone else has had to cite my name ever since. And so I end up being kind of trotted out as the expert on managing danger in fieldwork, when I'm not, or at least I don't feel I'm any more of an expert than any of you. So thank you for telling me things you already know and for not laughing at my naivete or any of the mistakes I might make. I wanted to start with some quotes about doing fieldwork with perpetrators of violence, or doing fieldwork on conflict, because I think they're reflective of a lot of the themes we've been talking about yesterday and today, and will continue tomorrow. And the first quote I wanted to read was from Richard Lee. Richard Lee's a sociologist. He's actually written the most about managing danger in fieldwork. He's written a book of his own on dangerous fieldwork, and 2 or 3 edited volumes, et cetera, et cetera. But he recounts the story from British sociologist Robert Moore, who told how that during his field work, the police told him to move on he was in the middle of a riot, a racially charged riot, and the police came and told him, move on. And he thought, what does the eager researcher do when told to move on? Well, he runs around the block, takes off your coat, and then strolls innocently back into the middle of the riot again. And that's really kind of what happens when you're researching violence. We kind of willfully enter the situation, maybe naively, or certainly relatively naively, but we mean to be there. And when we're told to shoo on or not to go there, we go there anyway. Because it reminds me of Tony Robbins and Carolyn Nordstrom's injunction from Fieldwork Under Fire, where they wrote, socio-political violence can be approached in many ways, but at some level, however, to be able to discuss violence, one must go to where the violence occurs, research it as it takes place. And that's the hallmark of anthropology, isn't it? Other social scientists write about violence, but they don't do the field work. They don't often go into the middle of the violence. They observe it from a distance. They interview people in the jails or after the fact and that kind of thing. But field work means that we're frequently there confronting the violence and becoming part of it, because to observe, as the next quote from Christopher Burnett makes the point, that by entering the dangerous field, we become not just observers of it, but actually participants in it in a whole bunch of ways. So Christopher Burnett wrote, the dangerous field imposes an even greater limitation on our vision, as it reminds us that as we observe, we participate. And when we do so in the midst of violence, we become part and parcel of it. Then my friend Neil Whitehead, who, as you know, unfortunately passed away recently, he reflected that a moment's reflection should indicate that to witness physical violence is in itself extremely dangerous and necessarily entails complex ethical judgments as to how and whether such events should be described and published. And then finally, I wanted to quote another colleague of ours, Cynthia Kepley Mahmood, who wrote a tremendous article in Anthropology and Humanism Quarterly called Anthropology from the Bones, a memoir of fieldwork survival and commitment, about her having been raped and sexually assaulted in India in an attempt to prevent her from doing her fieldwork. And she wrote that pursuing the truth is a highly political endeavor. It is not the way of safety, of security, of sweet dreams. It is jihad. And before I launch in, so I want to give you a quick little bit of background. So I did my research in Northern Ireland. I was there initially in 1982. A field worker, an anthropologist from Berkeley, had been there in 1974 and had been shot by the Irish Republican Army. So he apparently failed to manage the danger of his field work. And I had been told about why he was shot and had some basic ideas about the things he had done wrong. But I certainly understood that it was objectively dangerous to go there because an anthropologist had already been shot there. And well, my initial research was not on the Irish Republican Army. It was on popular support for the IRA and the Irish National Liberation Army. You may recall Mao Zedong's famous metaphor about guerrilla warfare, that the guerrilla is like a fish and it swims in the civilian population is the sea, the friendly environment that they survive. And I was interested in the sea, not the fish. I wanted to know how people got along with the IRA and why they supported them or why they didn't support them, what their relationship with the guerrilla fish was. And then I've been back to Belfast since then, 2 other field trips. I was there in 1991, and this time I did do direct research with a paramilitary group called the Irish People's Liberation Organization. And then I've been back a 3rd fieldwork time in 2004, which is the first time there was peace in Northern Ireland, because the peace process began in 1993. So 2 periods of fieldwork in the war years in Northern Ireland, and 1 period of fieldwork in the so-called peace years, the peace process years. Because as you know, there hasn't been peace, there just hasn't been war, as again Carolyn Nordstrom describes that as, you know, that context of not peace, not war. And I just thought I would, you know, kind of quickly show, these photos were all photos I took during my fieldwork, and all of them have stories behind them, and the only ones I didn't take were this black and white one here and the 2 of me, which is this one and the one up in the far right-hand corner with the kids. And I was taking pictures of the kids, and I decided to hand them the camera and let them take one of me as well. And the rest are all fieldwork photos. It means to convey the dynamic quality of the danger, because I'll tell a couple of little war stories. So there's Jerry Adams, by the way, in the top, the second from the left at the IRA funeral. And as you know, he was arrested last week. So I had permission to take all of these photos. I asked before I took them. The Sinn Féin gave me permission to take photos of those. The IPLO gave me permission to take these photos of them at their funerals and things like that. The picture of the Royal Ulster Constabulary policeman, I asked him before I took the photo, and he allowed me to take that. The picture of the Ulster Defence Regiment soldier, I asked him if I could take that. And we were talking before, you know, in many of these conflict situations, it's illegal to take photographs of the military forces, yet alone the guerrilleros, because of course what they're doing is illegal, and taking pictures of them is extremely dangerous to them if the wrong people get a hold of those photos. But nonetheless, I had permission to take them all, what happened was here is that I did this research covertly with the Irish People's Liberation Organization. Normally when you go into the field, you tell everyone what you're doing and you're above board, and this had to be done covertly, because I couldn't tell everyone that I'm hanging out with the Irish People's Liberation Organization and interviewing them and writing a book. They knew I was. Everybody else in the community thought I was doing research on the Loyalist death squads and on murals and the other things I did at the same time. The INLA, or the Irish People's Liberation Organization, I had an agreement officially with this gentleman, Martin O'Prey, and he was the military commander of the IPLO, and Jimmy Brown, he was the political commander of the IPLO, the classic revolutionary model of the party and the army. And a few weeks after I started my research, Rook was killed by assassinated by a Loyalist death squad, and 2 months after I left fieldwork, Jimmy Brown was killed by one of his own men, a member of his own organization, who had become a drug dealer. And immediately, when that happened, the Irish Republican Army moved in, and in a covert, large-scale operation, forcibly disbanded the IPLO. And that left this point. So I had to manage a relationship with the IRA, the INLA, the IPLO, all of them competitors, the army and the police, the combatants. And finally, there were hoodlums in the community, like you'll find in any impoverished ghetto community anywhere. There was a criminal element. You know, you could just be mugged. Didn't have anything to do with politics. You could be robbed, and, you know, like women can be raped or attacked. It didn't have anything to do with the political situation. So you have to kind of balance all of these things at the same time in an active war zone, an active combat situation. And so there's a dynamic quality, all these different competing elements. Some are kind of partially allied with each other, but also competing with each other. Some are outright enemies at war with each other. And of course, what that means is that while I'm going to explain that we use rational foreplanning and reason to manage the dangers of fieldwork, it's never really impossible to manage it entirely when there's all these dynamic elements constantly going on at the same time. Then the final thing I wanted to say was that there are two of those photos, these ones, there, and there, was an IPLO operation, a propaganda operation, where they met in a house and they brought out their weapons and they put these uniforms on and they ran out onto the street and they set up a checkpoint and they were stopping cars. And the idea was that because there's undercover SAS and British intelligence units operating in these ghettos, you set up these checkpoints to see if you can catch one of these military units in the operation. And they said, well, come with us, Jeff, and take photos for the book. And I wasn't quite sure. That isn't exactly what I thought I was going to do when I showed up at the house. They said, come to this house and we're going to show you some gear or whatever. And then I realized they were going to do this operation. They said, come with us out on the street as we did this thing. And I kind of had my little camera. I went, And this gentleman, if you see the two IPLO guerrilleros, over here on the right, you can hardly see there's a photographer. He was their photographer. They had their own photographer to take photos. And they said, well, if he's going to go out there, maybe I should. And then the spur of the moment with no foreplan, I hadn't thought about it. I had never had any plan to go on any kind of a military operation. These ghettos were under British military occupation. There were random foot patrols and armored patrols constantly driving through. There were helicopters constantly overhead. The SAS would hijack houses. They come in the night and they take over the house and the family and they set up a machine gun in the window. The idea so they can prevent this kind of thing from happening. And so had they stopped a car and there had been an SAS unit in the car, there would have been an immediate shootout. The British Army operated under a policy called shoot to kill, which is a normal wartime policy. Even though the British claimed that there was no war in Northern Ireland, there was just some kind of criminal elements going on there. In a criminal situation, the police are required to say, halt, police, and stuff like that. In a wartime situation, they don't do. They just shoot first. When you see the enemy, you don't call out, halt, surrender, you just open fire on them. So at any minute, we could have just been shot down on the street. And I ran around with them and I took terrible photos because I was kind of shooting and they were jumping up and hiding and they're all blurred except for that one. And that one you can't really tell because it's so small. But if you saw it in larger format, it's blurred because he's moving and I'm kind of shaking and I wasn't quite sure when I shot these photos. And then after the fact, when I went back to my flat, I kind of realized I was kind of shaking. Did I really just do that? So there was no planning about that. I had not made as far as I had known up until that point, my pre-planned decision was I was not going to participate or go along and observe any military operations of the IPLO. I was just going to go and visit them and interview them in safe houses and go across the border and meet them in Dublin and things like that. So there is an indeterminate quality when you're doing research with perpetrators of violence, which means that you can never really plan it and be entirely rational about it. So that's what I wanted to start with. I also wanted to then finally start with another quote, but from Chris Hedges about doing research with perpetrators. And he wrote, "I have spent time with mass killers, warlords, death squad leaders as a reporter in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. Some are psychopaths who relish acts of sadism, torture, and murder. But others, maybe most, see killing as a job, a profession, good for their careers and status. They enjoy playing God. They revel in the hyper-masculine world of force where theft and rape are perks. They proudly refine the techniques of murder to snuff out one life after another, largely numb to the terror and the cruelty they inflict. And when they are not killing, they can sometimes be disarmingly charming and gracious. Some are decent fathers and sentimental with their wives and mistresses. They can dote on their pets. It is not the demonized, easily digestible caricature of a mass murderer that most disturbs us. It is the human being." And that reminds me of Ronald's paper yesterday, literally an anthropology of cruelty and anthropology of violence, and that we are going to relate to people as human beings. And that's the empathetic relationship we have that I think is the ultimate basis of managing the danger of working with these people, is that we do understand whether we agree with them or disagree with them, whether we despise their activities or not, that we try to approach them as human. We understand them as human beings. deeply flawed as they may be. Well, as we all know in this room, ethnography of terror or of violence is by its nature high risk anthropology. There are real personal dangers for any of us who dare to speak or write or act against hate or against state terror. And managing danger in fieldwork has become a particular issue. 5 minutes. Oh gosh, okay, it's become a particular issue for those of us who now are trying to do research directly with the perpetrators of violence themselves. Most, if not all, of those who have done this kind of research have faced risks. The risks include all of the people I know who've done this kind of research have been threatened in one form or another, including harassment, intimidation, physical and sexual assault, arrest, interrogation, torture, persecution, prosecution, imprisonment, and ultimately extrajudicial execution or assassination. In recent years, as we say, there's been a tremendous shift now towards actually studying perpetrators, and it has really brought into focus then this issue then of actually trying to manage these dangers so that we can do this work and do it and survive it. Well, I was one of the first to write about managing danger in fieldwork, and these are my publications. But since then, since the first one written in 1989, a really good literature has emerged. There's at least a half a dozen books and another half dozen edited volumes that specifically address issues of managing danger in fieldwork. And of course, the edited volumes, having 8 or 10 articles in each, mean that almost any form of danger that you might encounter has been written about by someone somewhere. Not only that, but the reflexive literature in ethnography has become so massive that nowadays you can pretty much find reflexive accounts of having conducted fieldwork anywhere you're going to go. So if you decide you're going to do research in Guatemala, well, of course, the first thing you should do is read the reflexive literature by other people who have done fieldwork in Guatemala and how the kind of risks they faced and how they survived that. And that's true anywhere in the world. So preparing and planning for doing this kind of research involves reading the literature, the reflexive literature. So those two types of literature specifically on managing danger and reflexive literature of other field workers that have already done it. So I won't give you a quick summary of those major publications, but they are in the bibliography of my articles, and they're on, 2 of those articles are on the website for our workshop here today. So if you're interested, you can have a look at those. I don't really have a lot of time. I'm going to just show you a couple of things. In the last few years, this idea of risk intelligence, this is new stuff because a lot of you already heard my stuff before, but this concept of risk intelligence, and it has 2 dynamics. Partly it's an elaboration of the notion in business studies of risk management in business. And the other one is there's a psychological notion of risk intelligence, which is an elaboration of like emotional intelligence or IQ. And you remember that the original notion of IQ was a single solitary form of intelligence, and then the psychologists developed 9 different types or subtypes of intelligence. And risk intelligence is supposed to be the 10th, the newest form of risk intelligence. And the common definitions are identification, analysis, assessment, control, avoidance, and minimization or elimination of unacceptable risks, or the capacity to learn about risk from experience in an effort to mitigate it. And one of the funny things about the RQ, or the risk intelligence, is that apparently we aren't very good at it. And that we're not very intelligent. So this quote from Risk Intelligence, the book, says that most people are not good at assessing risk. In relation to risk, stupidity seems to be humanity's default option. So once again, it kind of makes us humble about our plans to, rationally assess risk, and we can develop diagrams, all kinds of flow charts, and this kind of thing about risk management, and I can talk about the mechanisms for doing that. But nonetheless, it turns out when it comes right down to it, we're not actually apparently very good at risk assessment. And it reminds us, Tony mentioned this morning already, a student who said, I think I'll just, put my thumb out and hitchhike into Chechnya and talk to some guerrilla fighters and stuff like that. Well, so he would have a very low RQ, or risk intelligence, and IQ possibly as well, kind of thing as well. But nonetheless, today, most of us will have to do research or field work with perpetrators. You will have to clear an ethics committee, an institutional IRB. And IRBs have got a lot of flack from ethnographers. We've had the most trouble with IRBs. Nonetheless, I've been on an IRB, and Ronald has as well. And one thing that they do is they do force students in particular to all absolutely focus now on these issues. And the risk to the researcher is right at the top of IRB's concerns. At my university, it's the first risk they identify as risk to the researcher. And that's partly because the universities are afraid of the financial liability of students might sue them or something like that. But nonetheless, you know, it means that when you go to the IRB, they ask about your safety. And so students have maybe vaguely thought about risk management, but haven't really focused their minds on it. I'm just going to stick my thumb out and hitchhike in there, are suddenly required to actually sound like they have a plan, right? Maybe it isn't a very good plan, but you know, you can't just say, oh, I'll figure it out when I get there, you know, or something like that. You're supposed to have a risk management plan. And so this is the idea of developing a risk intelligence or even a risk intelligence platform. And if you can tell the IRB when they go, and what is your plan for managing danger? You say, I have a risk intelligence platform for it, then they will be impressed. And the way you impress them is by saying that, just as I said before, that you've read the literature on managing danger in fieldwork. You've got a bibliography to show you if you've read that you've read the accounts of other researchers who have been there, and that you can intelligently answer common sense questions that they might have about, you know, how will you manage the danger there. Again, that notion of common sense, that you're just going to rely on common sense. If common sense is our cue, again, apparently the psychological researchers claim that we're not very good at it. So it's partly a matter of convincing the IRB that you've done that. I could say a lot more about it. I'm just going to make a couple of points about this kind of risk assessment model that looks really rational. The first stage is this one. It's a circle, is the risk assessment. You know, it's pre-thinking out, trying to identify the potential risks. There's all kinds of those, of course. Some that people frequently don't consider are the degree of uncertainty itself is a risk. You kind of think of these specific things like managing relationship with the Army, managing relationship with the guerrilleros, but what about just literally the degree of uncertainty? There are the ethical risks. We were going to talk maybe about Jerry Adams tomorrow, his being arrested, you know, about informed consent, anonymity, confidentiality. There's the risk of operational breakdown. And of course, we usually pretend no, it won't break down. I will be a success. I'm a PhD student. My degree is online. I am not going to fail. I have no plan for failure. Well, of course, you have to actually have a plan for failure as well. Then there's consultation. Consultation is with your supervisors, obviously. All of the IRBs now recognize the primary role of supervisors in preparing their students for managing dangers of fieldwork. Peer review with your colleagues. Two types of colleagues, generally your disciplinary colleagues, and second, the people in other disciplines, or not even disciplines. It could be journalists or just people who have been to the place where you're going to do research and know it well. Maybe they grew up there or lived there, and talk to them about the dangers and difficulties. And then other experts and experienced people. Then there's preparation. The preparation is the reviewing the literature and developing your risk protocol plan. The risk protocol plan or mitigation plan will have to, after you develop it, is supposed to be reviewed. And normally what we would do in social anthropology or cultural anthropology is talk about it with our peers and colleagues. So that's peer review. But also we're required now to go through management, and that's who the IRB are. So in business studies, it would be approving your risk mitigation plan with the management. Well, management to us at universities is the IRB. So we go through the IRB, and as I said, this is a tremendous focusing point. To get through the IRB, you need to have thought about it to convince them that you've thought about it. Then the risk. Once that risk mitigation plan should also include some basic things like first aid. Surprisingly enough, and the other is an emergency exit strategy. Right? You should always have an emergency exit strategy. A credit card. You should be able to get almost any place in the world, take a credit card and go and get a taxi out of there. Take a taxi to the airport. Take a taxi to the bus station. Literally an escape plan. You should be able to flee at short notice. Then when you get into the field and you're doing your field work, there's risk awareness. Risk awareness is recognizing the anticipated risks when they arise and recognizing new risks that you didn't anticipate, and also just learning how to survive. The first time I was under gunfire, I was walking down the street and I was with 2 local guys, and I heard bang, 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 and I looked around and they were gone. They were gone. Then I looked down and they were in the culvert next to the road, and I was going, what was that? You know, well, any soldier, I think, in a combat zone, the first time they come under fire, that's what they do. They go, whoa, what was that? Are they shooting at me? Huh? And then everybody's, get down, you fool. And then the next time you come under fire, you get, your immediate instinctive reaction has a drop. So there's a learning process, of risk recognition that goes on in the field. And then risk response and management, that's applying your mitigation plan. You are supposed to, when new risks arise or unanticipated risks, you're supposed to seek advice. And the IRBs require you to do that. Being on the IRB, I notice that everyone forgets that as soon as the students when they walk out the door. But the IRB says that should anything change or any risk arise during the course of your field, you must come back to the IRB. No one ever does, or not in my experience they ever do, but you're supposed to. Well, maybe you won't go back to the IRB, but seek advice. Don't just figure it out for yourself, huh? Seek advice. If something new comes up, unanticipated events occur, seek advice. Phone your supervisor. Talk to people around you, especially the people you're doing your field work with. You need to learn how to adapt and evolve and develop new strategies as they arrive. You learn how to duck, get behind something, recognize where the mines may be laid in the road and where kinds of places you should walk and shouldn't walk, where snipers may be, et cetera, et cetera. Adapt and exit and escape when you must. And when new situations arise, you're supposed to reassess, which means to go back to number 1. So it's supposed to always be a kind of cycle that goes on. It's supposed to be a dynamic process of risk management, again, rather than a notion that before you go there, you make a plan, then when I get there, I apply my plan, and then I'm safe. But the dynamic nature of the risk, because they change and they shift all the time, means you've constantly got to be managing it and adapting and learning and reapplying and going back to number 1 again and seeking advice some more, and then to go to the next thing, then a new thing happens and you make a new risk plan, etc., etc. I think I'm out of time. I could say a lot more. And so just to finalize, I didn't get kneecapped or shot. And my initial publication, or the first thing I wrote, it's not going to give it to me, was the prologue to my book, and it was called I'm Alive and Well, My Kneecaps Are Still Intact, and My Research is Coming Along Fine. And that's what I used to write back to my supervisor at Berkeley and my folks and my friends, and to let them know I was safe, and kind of made a joke of it and that kind of thing. But I survived so far, and I hope that you all will too, because some of us haven't. As you know, some of us have been killed during our field work, and that I would like to learn from you how you have the kind of things you've encountered and how you've managed it. And again, I want to apologize for kind of setting myself up as being the expert on risk management when all of you have certainly got as much experience as I do in this field. So again, the details of, if you want more of the kind of micro details and recommendations for specific ways to manage danger in your field work, they're in my publications, especially the most recent one that I've written, and it's on the website for the workshop. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.